Okay, so we are going to continue our conversation on what socialism is, why it's the deadliest ideology in history. Is it here in America? How is it here if it is? What do the democratic socialists mean? All of these things that can't really be discussed in just a short reel. Okay, so first of all, what is socialism? I've already explained this, but I'll explain it again. Socialism under the Marxist-Leninist framework. Okay, so let's just start with this, because there is this postmodernist tendency to say that, well, you know, words can mean whatever I think they mean, and somebody described it this way and another person described it another way. So how do we really know what anyone means when they say socialism? Okay, if you decide that words don't mean anything anymore, then we're in big trouble, okay? We have to settle on objective definitions of words, and the objective definition on socialism under the Marxist-Leninist framework, right? And Marx is the founding father of modern socialism, and Lenin was the first person to develop it through the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The definition of socialism is the transitional state between capitalism and communism, when capitalism has been abolished and the means of production have been seized in the hands of the collective, which is the state, right? Because how can millions of people own or manage anything? Technically, everyone owns everything, but who's managing it? That is the state. So even Marx himself referred to this state as the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was never intended to be cute. The entire point of socialism is that, in theory, the power has been taken by the people, by the working class, and you have no way or means to disagree with it because it is now a dictatorship. Now, of course, the first and eternal objection is, but is that what anyone means when they say socialism? And the first thing that comes to people's minds is, well, what we think that people mean here in America when they say socialism is actually social democracy, which is what they have in Europe, which is what they have in Scandinavia. Now, a social democracy is actually a system of capitalism. It is capitalism with higher taxation, as I explained, and that higher taxation funds social programs and welfare. It is based on a foundation of capitalism. Socialism, you have to understand, is the opposite, because it abolishes capitalism, it abolishes the free market, right, and replaces it with a centrally planned economy, which we'll get into. So the whole point is that no, socialism isn't Europe. And then people will say, yeah, but you know what? When people are voting for socialism, because let's be clear about this, these are actually really terrifying statistics. 60% of Democrats in the United States now say that they choose or prefer socialism over capitalism. Now, most people on the left who would hear that, they would respond by saying, yeah, but they just don't know what socialism means. That 60% genuinely doesn't know what socialism means. That is even scarier. That is even scarier, that you're voting for a system that you don't know what it means, and you don't know the historic death and devastation that is concomitant with that system. Oh, but what they really mean is social democracy. And when they're voting for democratic socialists, they think or they mean that they're voting for social democrats, which brings us to the crux of who are you actually voting for, and why do you believe that they are somebody that they're not? The Democratic Socialists, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, explicitly state that their objective is the end of capitalism. If they were going for social democracy, why would they not call themselves social democrats? Why have they explicitly chosen to identify as democratic socialists? Why do they explicitly say that their objective is the end of capitalism? Why do they say that that's what they mean? And I think what this really exposes to me is the grace that people give to alarm bells when they're occurring on their side of the aisle rather than on the opposite side of the aisle. Because think about it like this. If there was a group on the right called the Democratic Fascists of America, and they explicitly said, we are fascists, and they explicitly said that what we mean is a literal fascism, but we think that you should vote your way into fascism instead of through revolution, would you then give them the same grace of saying, oh, I'm sure that they just really don't know what fascism, I'm sure that they don't really mean fascism. When they say that they believe some people are superior to others, what they really mean is that, you know, we should have separate men and women's bathrooms for safety reasons. Okay, but that is not fascism. That is not fascism. And that isn't what they're saying. What they're saying is that they believe in fascism and they mean fascism and they identify as fascists. Would you give them the grace? And if 60% of people on the right said that they now prefer fascism over liberalism, would you say, oh, yeah, but 60% of people on the right just don't know what fascism means? Is that an excuse? That might be true. I actually agree. I don't think that 60% of the American left agree with socialism or support socialism because they know what it is. I think the great majority of them have no idea what it is. But is that an excuse? Would we tolerate 60% of people on the right saying that they support fascism over liberalism just because they don't know what it means? And you know they just mean having separate bathrooms. Nobody would think that was okay. So we have to treat what happens on the left and the right with the same caution, with the same alarm bells. And when the left and the right show you that the fringe has now infiltrated into the mainstream, you have to pay attention to that fact. Because what most people would say is that, yeah, the reason most people are voting for democratic socialism, the reason these candidates keep winning is because what they really want is a social democrat. Well, where's your social democrat? Where's your social democrat that is promising not to end capitalism, not to end liberal democracy, to say, actually, we want to preserve all of those things and just tax more so that we can fund these social programs? And the fact that there isn't this rise in social democratic candidates really speaks to the fact that the fringe on the left have become the mainstream. And maybe there is this conflict between what the majority of the left now think or believe versus what the DSA is claiming to stand for. Maybe there is that conflict, but that's even worse. You know why? Because either the DSA don't know what democratic socialism is and they actually mean something else, in which case, how can you support people who don't know what they stand for, or they know exactly what they stand for and what the majority of people are voting for isn't that? That is an even worse conflict. Okay, so now let's talk about why is socialism so devastating, so destructive? Why is it the deadliest ideology in human history? Now, what's so important to think about is the fact that so many people will respond by saying, but hang on a minute, capitalism is just as deadly, if not more, if not deadlier, right? So what's important to understand is that capitalism isn't an ideology. It's not, I wouldn't even call it an economic system. It is something that spontaneously arises whenever individuals are sovereign, whenever individual freedoms exist. People just buy and sell. Trade just exists organically and spontaneously. There was never a capitalist manifesto. Nobody ever theorized, right? Nobody ever came up with the idea, ergo ideology, of capitalism. It's a naturally occurring phenomenon. Whereas socialism as an ideology, it is an idea that is artificial. And there's this sort of utopic vision that if we just do things this way, instead of how they naturally occur, then things will be amazing, okay? Well, we've seen the results historically of what that really looks like, which I will get into. So the reality is that, yes, people have died under capitalism, but capitalism isn't an ideology. And then someone might say, well, you know what? The things that are concomitant with capitalism or that have existed alongside capitalism, such as imperialism, such as colonialism, such as slavery, have caused just as many, if not more, deaths. True. Again, those are not an integral and necessary part of capitalism. They might be an extension of capitalism in some regards. How do you know that you don't have to have those things with capitalism? Because guess what? We exist right now with capitalism and without slavery. Slavery is evil. Imperialism is evil. Colonialism is evil. And I get the argument of, it's not entirely independent of capitalism because the need for labor and greed all of those things lead to things like slavery and imperialism. But the argument essentially is that capitalism can exist without it. Capitalism can exist with authoritarianism, and capitalism can exist with liberal democracy. So the ideology that we have that surrounds capitalism is liberalism. The ideology is that, you know, we should protect individual rights, individual liberties, individual freedoms. That is the ideology. But capitalism is just a naturally occurring phenomenon. I think the bigger point and the main point to take away from all of that is that you can say as many bad things about capitalism, you can say the worst things about capitalism, and you're probably right, but capitalism can be done right. On the other hand, there is no example in history, in all of time, where socialism has ever worked. Ever. Not once. And this wasn't just tried once or twice and it didn't really work out. At its peak, during the 20th century, 1/3 of the earth was under socialist rule. Almost half the world was under socialism, and it failed everywhere. In every single instance, in every single country where socialism ran its course, the entire society collapsed, which meant that they had to return to capitalism, or before collapse, they had to reopen the market because it was leading to collapse. So historically, we've seen the evidence now that it is quite literally impossible for socialism to exist without devastation and destruction. Capitalism, on the other hand, can and has caused devastation and destruction, but it is a naturally occurring phenomenon that amongst conscious human beings can be done right. And that is why we want to get capitalism right. I'm not saying that capitalism is the end and final goal, because I'm not a clairvoyant. Maybe there's going to be something that arises in the future that's better than anything we've ever known. But in terms of the systems that we know and have seen, the only thing that has ever worked for human beings in all of human history is some variation of capitalism, whether it is social democracy like what they have in Europe, or a little bit more stringent capitalism like what we have here in the United States. And what we should be doing in the United States is that, I guess this leads me to the question of, you know, I think people spend a lot of time trying to figure out what my position is, you know? They're like, is she on the left? Is she on the right? What does she really believe? There's like this almost idea that I'm hiding my true feelings from you. The reason that you can't suss out my position is because I genuinely don't have one. If a person has a position that they're trying to hide, they will eventually reveal it without meaning to. The reason that I'm never revealing my position is because I genuinely do not have one. And the reason I think that I don't have a position is because I've just read too much, and there's just too much nuance for me to see any real objective, like, absolutes. There's too much nuance for me to think in absolutes. Like, just to answer this question of, you know, would I personally go for social democracy or more stringent capitalism? Would I choose Scandinavia or the United States? Well, let's just think about the fact that I've actually lived under both systems. I'm from Europe, right? From England, and I was born and raised there. And I have been living in the US for the past 10 years. So I do know what it's like to have free healthcare, and I do know what it's like to live under a system of private healthcare. And what I would say is that the grass is never greener. Truly, the grass is never greener on the other side. Everything is a trade-off. With free healthcare, you get more access, which is great, but you get less quality. With private healthcare, you get higher quality but less access, which is unfair, right? Because that leads to a system where people who have more money, people who are more elite, get better quality healthcare. So I guess the question is not what's better, it's what is better for who, or in what ways is it better? So if you were to ask me what would I go for, what do I want to happen? Because if you notice, I'm never really arguing for anything. I'm only ever arguing against the extremes, which people don't recognize as the extremes. I guess that's what you could say I do for a living. I argue against the extremes that people don't recognize as extremes. What would I want to happen? I would want there to be an American left and an American right, where the American left do what they do and vote for, you know, more taxation and free healthcare and free education, and the American right do what they do and vote for more privatization and freer markets and less regulation and lower taxes. And I would want to live in a system where those two sides are being true to who they are and both of them have the right to vote. And whatever wins the vote, that's the system I will happily surrender to. That is what I want. That is what I love. Liberal democracy. Anything that is not in the world of those extremes, I'm good with it. So, okay, we've been dodging the main question. I've been dodging the main question for about however long now. So why is socialism so deadly? Why has it only ever produced death and destruction? So I could say to you that socialism means the abolition of capitalism, and it means the seizure of the means of production by the state, okay? In other words, seizure of the economy by the state. But you could still ask, well, what does that really mean? The total abolition of capitalism means that you don't own anything and you don't have the right to own anything. This is a really good way to ask yourself whether you live in a socialist society or not. And by the way, you don't live in a socialist society, because if you did, you would be dead or sincerely struggling, and you would know that you live under a socialist society. Ask yourself, do I have the right to own anything? Can I own my house? Can I own my car? Can I own a business? Can I sell anything? If the answer is yes, you don't live under socialism. You don't live under socialism because you have the individual right to ownership. Ergo, a liberal democracy with a capitalist framework. Okay, so all of those rights are subordinated under socialism because the individual right becomes subordinate to the collective right. So, for example, you couldn't own a hair salon, you couldn't own a shoe shop, you couldn't even own your own services. If you were a lawyer, you couldn't, own your own practice. If you were a dentist, you can't own your own practice. No matter how many clients you get, if you get one client a day or 30 clients a day, all of that profit goes to the state and it is fairly and evenly redistributed, right? So what would happen, technically in theory, is that there would be like a wage scale and your work or whatever it is that you do would be assigned to a wage scale and you would be paid technically, because this has never really happened, according to that grade. And that starts to lead us into one of the reasons why socialism always fails, which is the incentive problem. The incentive problem is that when you have no incentive to do more or to produce more, people stop doing and they stop producing. In fact, any idea or innovation that you can think of, none of that belongs to you anymore. All of that belongs to the state. And that is why it is something that is so fundamentally repugnant to anybody who believes in just human beings, not even somebody who believes in liberalism or just literally human beings, because human beings are wired to grow, to create, to achieve. Why would you want a system that doesn't allow you to do any of those things and takes those things from you because they think that it's in the collective interest? This is actually tied to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs says that the highest human need is self-actualization. Isn't that so crazy to think of? The highest human need literally requires a capitalist system because self-actualization is impossible under a socialist system that doesn't allow you to own your own product, to own your own innovation, to own yourself. You don't have any individual rights anymore. So that's one of the reasons why socialism fails repeatedly as an economy, is the incentive problem. But I actually think it isn't as much of an interesting question to ask, why does the economy itself fail? Because that's not really my forte. That's not my niche. And I don't think that's what you're listening to this for. I think the more interesting question is, why is it always linked to authoritarianism? That's the interesting question. Before I get to that, I will just say one more point, which I think is really important to why socialism always fails, is because of the central thinker problem. So there's this idea under this centrally planned economy, right, that goes with socialism, that the central planners decide what the economy needs, but the economy cannot be decided by a centrally planned body. The economy is decided by how people participate in it. In our world, in our capitalist world, nobody's deciding the economy. The economy flows freely based on supply and demand. That's why they say that every purchase is a vote, right? But under a centrally planned economy, there's no way to know what each industry needs and therefore determine what the demands and what the supplies would be within those industries. Okay, that's the boring part. It's not even my forte. Don't want to talk about it. But that's essentially why, as an economic model, those two reasons are mostly what people say about why socialism always fails. Again, the more interesting question, why is it always linked to authoritarianism? i.e., this is answering the question of why can democratic socialism not exist? So democratic socialism, again, it is socialism, but achieved through democracy. That is what it purports to be, at least. It says, we do believe in socialism. We do believe in the abolition of capitalism, but we want to do all of this through democratic means, not through revolution. And so what I would say to that is that democratic socialism is impossible. It's also an oxymoron. The first way that I can tell you is that it's impossible is that it has never happened in history. And I promise you that everybody, or many people who attempted socialism, also believed in democratic socialism and couldn't make it work, right? So much of this is this sort of like Western arrogance, it's this Western hubris of like, okay, yeah, it failed in over almost half the world, but I swear when we do it, we're going to get it right. Really? When the majority of people don't even know what socialism is that are opting into socialism, now we're going to get it right? It's so arrogant. Why don't we honor the truth of this system's history? And yeah, many, many, many attempts were made to do socialism through democratic practices. It never worked. Why? Because socialism necessitates authoritarianism. So let me explain why. If the system seizes the means of production, okay, if the state seizes the economy, you don't have any right to choose differently. You don't have the right to dissent. So think about what your voting rights are based on, right? Think about what the US Constitution is based on. It is based on the protection of your individual rights, your right to property ownership, your right to free speech, your right to vote, and all of that is about the restriction on what government can do to you. So it isn't that you necessarily have the right to own things, it's that the government can't stop you from owning things. The government can't take your property, except in certain exceptions like eminent domain. Let's not even get to that because it's not important. But the point is that all of these, the concept of individual rights is about what the government can't encroach on. It's essentially saying that the individual is sovereign, the individual is free to do whatever the individual wants to do. And we have this constitution that basically says that the government can't stop you from doing these things. Now, under a socialist society, it is the exact opposite. All those freedoms that you want to enjoy, all of those individual rights that you would otherwise enjoy, the government has to restrict you. The government has to encroach on those rights because essentially what it's saying is that the system that we've planned is better for the collective, and you doing what you want to do as an individual is hindering the greater good, right? So if let's say, for example, that you're a farmer and you don't want to lose your farm, but under socialism, your farm can't belong to you anymore. The farm belongs to the state. Let's say you live in a democratic socialist system. So it is socialism, but technically you have the right to vote. Okay, what do you have the right to vote for? Can you vote and say, actually, I would like to keep my farm, please? No, you can't opt out. So what does your vote mean? What does your vote mean when you can't choose differently? And that is quite literally the definition of authoritarianism. When you cannot dissent or choose differently to the ruling party, to the ruling system, Okay, that is what authoritarianism means. And under socialism, you cannot dissent or choose differently because what you want as an individual doesn't matter anymore. The sovereign individual is no longer respected. What matters is what's best for the collective. So your right to choose or dissent disappears. That is why socialism and authoritarianism cannot be decoupled. That is why you can vote until you're blue in the face, but nothing can ever change. So essentially, the point is that you can't have a democratic system when the markets are closed, because once the markets are closed, the decision lies in the hands of the state. And then I guess people would say, well, maybe we don't have property rights, but we would still have other rights, right? We would have other democratic rights under a socialist framework. Okay, what would be your rights then? What would be your rights? Oh, well, we would have the right to free speech. Again, you look at history, okay? You look at history, and nowhere in all of the 20th century socialist systems, societies, in the 1/3 of the Earth's surface that it conquered, never did you have the right to free speech under socialism. Are you really going to assume malice in every single one of those cases? You cannot assume that everybody is evil. You can't assume that for 100 years, over almost half the world that it was attempted, that everyone was just evil. There is a reason that things always end the same way. There is a reason that people always lost every single one of their rights. Let's say, you know, a democratic socialist says to you, okay, but we would still let you have the right to free speech. Let's consider how speech was expressed historically, right? It was through the printing press. But of course, the printing press now belongs to the state. And so the state decides what gets printed and what doesn't get printed. Now, if your argument is that, but I'm sure that the state would be so totally objectively fair and honest and would allow everyone to criticize them, even though they could just totally shut it down. Okay. But what somebody else might say is that, okay, but, you know, the modern expression of free speech now is done through social media. Okay, so now X, which once belonged to Elon Musk, has been nationalized. Instagram, Meta, which once belonged to Mark Zuckerberg, has now been nationalized, i.e. the state owns those mediums. Well, couldn't we still just go on Meta and X and just criticize the government, the state, as much as we wanted? Let's consider the fact that the state is now your everything, because the individual is no longer sovereign. The state is your landlord. The state is your boss. The state is your employer. The state is your everything. Do you feel like you could confidently go online and criticize your employer? If a democratic socialist state genuinely allowed free speech, genuinely allowed everybody to go onto its forums that it now owns and to express as much dissatisfaction as they want to express, that leads to revolution. And so what socialist systems learn over time is that you actually have to suppress free speech, because nobody is happy under socialist societies. And if enough people are allowed to express how dissatisfied they are, it will lead to a revolution that collapses the system. That is why free speech has always had to be suppressed under socialist societies. That is why every single individual right always had to be suppressed under socialist societies. That is why dissenters always had to be killed under socialist societies, because it invariably goes the same way, that for socialism to preserve itself, it necessitates authoritarianism. And this idea of democratic socialism, if you want to say that it is possible, then find one example in history where it has ever been possible. But I think a better question is not, you know, let's find an example of it to prove that it could work or that it might be a good idea. The better question is, why are you defending this system anyway, right? And I don't mean you, literally the person watching this. I mean rhetorically, why are you trying to find arguments to defend the deadliest ideology in human history? Who does that? That's like the same, it's like arguing, well, you know, I'm sure imperialism and colonialism can be done well. Well, yeah, it sure can, but why would you defend it, right? In fact, Cuba under American imperialism was one of the most prosperous economies in the region. Does that make American imperialism okay? No, because Cuba was not sovereign, and actually there was a lot of class discrimination under American imperialism as well. Now, of course, what followed after American imperialism, the socialist system that replaced it, was obviously dramatically worse. You could make arguments in favor of imperialism, but when you know how much pain and destruction and devastation that has caused, why would you defend it? And that's the same thing that you have to ask yourself now. Why are you trying to defend socialism? And I don't mean Europe. I don't mean social democracy. When somebody tells you that they want to end capitalism, why are you sitting there thinking of like, okay, but every time capitalism has ended in history, it has just been disaster. But let me try and think of ways to defend that. That is where you have to understand that tribalism has superseded your logical mind. Because you're defending something that you don't even want. There is not a single person that listens to the description of socialism and thinks to themselves, yeah, I want that. There's not a single person that hears, okay, I couldn't own anything. I wouldn't have any individual rights. I couldn't own my house. I couldn't own my car. I couldn't own a business. I would have to be on a waiting list to receive anything, a house, a home, anything. Nobody hears that and says, you know what? I would really love that for me. Everybody who hears that is like, that sounds awful and repugnant, as it historically has been. So why do you defend it? The reason why people are prone to defend it is because there has been this expansion of the concept of socialism in and amongst the left. Is exactly what I was saying earlier. There has been a rise in the fringe on the left that has infiltrated the mainstream left, that has poisoned it with this idea of socialism, that even when you hear how awful it sounds, your mind is trying to find ways to defend it, or to say, well, really, you know, even though they say that, that's not what they mean. You know, when somebody comes out there and announces that they are a socialist and they explicitly mean socialism, that should make you recoil as much as hearing a person say, I am a fascist and I believe in fascism. And the fact that it doesn't really speaks to the way that the tribal mind distorts reality to accept things that allow it to keep status and belonging within a group rather than to face exile from the group. And that is the thing that you have to be aware of if you find yourself defending these systems. Am I defending these systems because I truly believe in them, because any of this sounds like anything that I want? Or am I defending these systems because my tribe seems like it's starting to believe in them, and I feel like belonging to this tribe is much more important to my survival than dissenting? And that is a real impulse. That is a real impulse, because guess what? The human mind equates exile from the tribe with death, because that is historically what it has meant. And I think this is a good opportunity to think about how your tribal mind is causing you to think about things that are actually and truly devastating. It is so easy to see how that manifests on the other side. But guess what? Both sides have just as much tribal blindness as each other. So when you look at people on the right who would, I don't know who is, but if somebody openly said in Congress, yes, I'm a fascist and I believe in fascism, you would look at that person and think, my God, how do you not see who and what you are? And all of the people that voted for that person, you would think, how do these people not see who and what they are? And look at the way that you also can't see yourself when we talk about concepts like socialism. And why do concepts like socialism get more of a pass than fascism, even though it has a higher death toll? Because socialism wears the mask of humanity. That's why it has been even more successful than fascism, because there's been less objection. There's less objection because people genuinely believe that this is a good thing for humanity, for the greater good, and ignore the history and ignore the evidence. So I guess the takeaway from all of this is that there has been a rise of the Marxist-Leninist fringe among the left, and that should spell alarm bells. And the DSA does believe in socialism and the abolition of capitalism, and explicitly says so. And all of this is just testimony to the fact that the mainstream left doesn't observe the traditional values of liberalism that it once did, because liberalism believes in protecting individual rights. And that is why so many people often say, including me, I didn't leave the left left me. And the rise of the Mamdani era is proof of that fact.